The Heresy at Skunk works. They didn't start with an airplane. They started with a mistake radar shouldn't forgive. In a windowless room at the ranch, engineers set a metal wedge under a spotlight and watched the return collapse. The paper that made it possible wasn't secret and wasn't American. Piotr Ufimtsev had written in dense math that energy slides along edges and leaks from corners. If you could predict the leaks, you could starve the receiver. To most, it was elegant theory. To Denai's overholser, it was a recipe. The price of using it was ugliness. Kelly Johnson's airplanes had been sculptures. U-2, a 12, SR-71, curves tuned to air like music. Ben Rich walked in with a mock-up that looked carved by a blunt chisel. Flat facets, sharp chines, no sweep unless a computer swore a radar wouldn't see it. Johnson squinted, then said the line only a leader invested in the future gets to say, "Prove it." Proving it meant accepting that aerodynamics and electromagnetics wanted different shapes. The faceting that bounced radar away also bounced stability out the window. The model swiveled like it wanted to sit backward. The cure lived in code. Fly by wire or don't fly, Rich told test pilots, and they believed him because the airframe didn't. Control laws hijacked physics millisecond by millisecond, lying to surfaces until the airplane believed it was stable long enough to be useful. The first air breathed at Area 51. Have Blue arrived at night, rolled under sodium lamps that looked like secrecy turned into weather, and taxied past hangars that had seen stranger. Orders banned the word stealth from unclassified memos. Crews called it shape, signature, or simply the thing. Radar range days felt like seances for engineers. Stand back, hold your coffee, don't breathe while the scope sweeps. Numbers came back indecently small. Against some sets, the return went under the noise floor. The room stayed silent because careers had been wagered on the possibility that nothing could be measured. Nothing isn't an instrument, flight rules. Hiding from radar meant hiding from friends. No handy TACAN beacon, no radar altimeter singing you through a dust layer. Everything that said safe to pilots lit up radar like a Christmas tree. So planning became ritual. Planners threaded routes through known emitters, turned the jet so facets never offered a broadside, and rehearsed until a 1-degree yaw felt like a crime. Soviet radars trucked to the desert got nicknames, Mary, Kathy, because it's easier to kill a signal when you can talk to it. The airplane didn't so much fly as present. It wasn't invincible. Heat bubbled the skin. Coatings demanded the kind of patience maintainers rarely have in hangars that smell like solvents and bad coffee. Knife edges had to be knife edges. A sloppy seam grew a signature you could see from space. Pilots learned to trust a black box that never blinked. Engineers learned that every convenience was a betrayer, and leaders learned that secrecy makes every mishap look like a program obituary. One prototype crashed, then another. Each time, you could feel the program inhale through its teeth. DARPA cheered because DARPA loves bets that offend physics. The Air Force hedged. The question wasn't only does it work, it was can we task it? How do you schedule something the tower can't see? How do you train crews to land on a dry lake bed at night because lights are loud? The answers arrived in checklists written in pencil and rewritten after every sortie. Then proof. Before the world learned the name F-117, the jet took a quiet walk over Panama. The screens that mattered showed weather. The targets that mattered stopped mattering. Back at Groom Lake, a few people allowed themselves a smile and then went back to measuring seams with a machinist's kiss. What the heretics had built wasn't magic. Shaping did most of the work. 3/4 of the radar cross-section reduction came from geometry. Coatings and ferrites were margin, not miracle. The rest lived in discipline. Shape, software, maintenance, mission planning. Every corner cut grew a blip. Every lazy rivet bought a radar operator a promotion. You didn't own invisibility. You rented it by the minute and paid in procedures. Meanwhile, the other religion, power plus coverage equals certainty, was waiting across an ocean, confident that energy and netting could force anything to declare itself. The Heresy answered with absence, and absence traveled well. In binder clips and test cards, in the way crews learned to treat a radar screen like an opponent instead of a mirror, the Heresy became a doctrine. Build more, train in silence, never offer a broadside, pretend you're not there even when you are. The Skunk works handed the Air Force a problem no syllabus covered. How do you integrate a whole? How do you write tactics around a platform whose first job is to erase itself? They didn't know yet that the first people to really understand the answer wouldn't be pilots or planners. They would be accountants, looking at a scope that showed weather and hearing a colonel say, "Increase emissions," and realizing in the pause before the next sweep that nothing had just been priced. The day radar blinked. Stakes were simple and brutal. Soviet air defense lived by a ladder: detect, track, engage. Detection wasn't a prelude, it was the doctrine. Then something new slid through the mesh and looked like weather. The first hints didn't arrive as alarms. They showed up as anomalies buried in training tapes from exports the USSR had scattered across allies, Baghdad among them. Technicians flagged ripples that rose and fell like noise, oddly timed to power dips and jamming that didn't match any catalogue. Analysts pulled the reels, ran them frame by frame, and saw nothing they could brief without risking a career. The scope showed clutter. The target map showed craters. What a small circle in Washington already had on paper. A 1985 CIA estimate warning Soviet air defenses would remain vulnerable to stealth aerodynamic systems for at least a decade. The physics pointed to absence. Facets and angles pushed energy away so efficiently that the few photons stumbling back hugged the noise floor. The radars weren't failing. Doctrine was. In vans wired by Soviet diagrams, crews did what training taught: ride the gain up when anxious. Increase emissions, get clarity. But power only helps if a wave hits square. Against a shape that refused broadside, more energy just lit up everything else. Hills, weather, ground returns, until the scope looked like snow with no confession tucked inside it. Operators chased ghosts across screens that hissed. In Moscow, the first shock wasn't a headline. It was a memo after Panama written in tidy, hedged prose. 2 targets engaged without prior classification. No early warning track recorded. Possible low observable threat. Possible equipment malfunction. Recommend review of frequency diversity and multistatic trials. Between the lines, we didn't see it coming, and we don't know why. Senior officers argued the comfortable alternatives. Better jamming, lower altitude, bad luck. That fit the ladder. Jamming you can counter. Altitude you can measure. Then the tapes from Desert Storm arrived. The Iraqi IADS, assembled from Soviet catalogues, SAR-2s, SAR-3s, SAR-6s, voice-netted control, sector radars layered like roofing tile, should have chewed on anything that showed. Instead, it folded, not instantly, but fast enough that radar-guided SAMs faded into statistical background after the opening days. AAA stitched the sky where doctrine said targets would appear. The black jets didn't run that play. A colonel who'd spent 2 decades coloring range rings traced an empty sweep with his finger and knew what no one wanted in minutes. The first rung was missing. Without reliable detection, the rest wasn't a sequence, it was a hope. His deputy glanced at procurement timelines and felt something colder. If stealth was real, and battle footage treated it as real, the fix wasn't a gadget, it was an architecture. The shopping list sounded simple in a sentence and savage in a ledger. Go long in wavelength, VHF-UHF arrays to blunt shaping. Go wide in geometry, multistatic constellations to triangulate whispers. Go tall, over the horizon fences to see beyond curvature and cue other sets. Add passive receivers to harvest emissions an airplane tried not to shed. Each idea carried merit. Together, they mapped onto a country's entire grid. One detail sharpened the problem. Stealth's edge wasn't a fuselage alone. Mission planning software in the US built routes that presented the worst possible angles to known emitters. Survivability lived in code and habit, treating radars like a chess opponent, never offering a broadside, never giving a timing pattern away for free. The PVO had to answer more than metal. It had to answer method. Engineers in Soviet labs, with Ufimtsev on their shelves too, argued counter-stealth was solvable, with enough sensors, enough integration, enough time. They were right in principle, but integration wasn't a slide. It was factories, clocks, train crews, and power budgets that didn't blink when the weather did, and a national ledger already pretending defense was smaller than it was. When Moscow finally published a larger number in 1989, the outside world was confused and the inside wasn't impressed. The figure looked big. It wasn't big enough for everything on the list. A micro story from a field unit captured the bind. A sector crew went to frequency agility to sniff below clutter. The scope teased a thin rise. The commander radioed possible bearing 317. By the time the angle resolved, the angle was behind them. In the log, someone wrote noise coincident. In the margins, someone else wrote again. So doctrine blinked. Briefings traded range rings for probability clouds. A slide appeared with 4 words that no one argued: unacceptable detection probability. The man reading it didn't dramatize. He priced fixes, multiband arrays, network time, fusion centers. The numbers didn't debate, they marched. On paper, the answer was straightforward. Buy enough sensors to make absence hurt less. In practice, it meant building a nation-sized listening machine faster than an opponent could change its rhythm. For the first time, generals trained to flood a sky with power heard the quiet truth inside the tapes. Detection is conditional, certainty is rented, and silence, priced over a decade, can break you. The accidental, economic weapon. Stakes shifted the minute. Nothing on scope turned into, we need everything at once. Counter-stealth wasn't a tweak, it was a posture, and posture costs. In Moscow, the fix that sounded tidy in a briefing, see lower, wider, farther, unfurled into procurement plans that touched every ministry with a soldering iron. VHF and UHF arrays to blunt shaping, multistatic constellations to triangulate whispers, over the horizon fences to cue sectors beyond curvature. Passive receivers to harvest emissions an airplane tried not to shed. Each layer reduced doubt. Each layer carried a bill. The action began as feasibility papers disguised as physics. Extend Nebo-class lines with digital back ends. Pair tired P-18 to new processors. Build synchronized time bases so sites kilometers apart could measure single-digit microseconds. None of that lived on a whiteboard. It lived in factories already late on radios, in microelectronics throttled by COCOM lists, in depots where spares moved on paper the way diesel moved by rumor. A colonel could demand a network. A plant director had to conjure clocks. Component reality bit fast. Low-frequency radars compensate for shaping, but they demand acreage, mast steel, and megawatts. Over-the-horizon fences need quiet bands and miles of wire. Multistatic requires clean oscillators, exact links, and fusion that doesn't crash when rain arrives sideways. Every clever idea spawned 3 new requirements. Every requirement spawned delay. The impact landed first at the plant gate. Directors were told to accelerate, while procurement officers came back from Moscow with thin envelopes. Copper quotas tightened. West German machine tools on order vanished to embargo. Substitute op amps changed noise floors, forcing new calibration cycles, forcing retests, forcing memos stamped temporary deviation. Morale sagged from pride to dark humor. A fitter held up a carton of imported chips and said, "This is what our doctrine looks like now." In kitchens, the shift felt blunter. Budgets that never admitted their full size now carried a line called counter-stealth priority. Bread deferred to bandwidth. Wives stood in longer lines while husbands did longer shifts. Managers learned triage, defer maintenance, cannibalize prototypes for parade units, borrow crews. "We'll catch up" slid down the calendar until it fell off. A micro story made it plain. A regional plant near Gorky won a contract to build low-band receiver front ends. The spec assumed Czechoslovak op amps. The shipment stalled. Engineering slotted a Soviet part with higher flicker noise. That forced a gain change in the analog path, which saturated in storms, which forced software filters, which needed a faster CPU, which the line couldn't build. The unit shipped within revised tolerance after the tolerance moved. The radar worked for demonstrations. It lied in weather. Training created its own invoice. For every array fielded, 3 crews needed certification. For every class, a university needed oscilloscopes and instructors who hadn't emigrated. Time bases had to agree across districts. Links had to stay up through winter. Doctrine had to reteach officers to fuse partials into decisions. Each lesson cost hours nobody had and rubles nobody counted out loud. Feedback made it worse. Early deployments produced mixed results. Better queuing here, a track rescued there. Those partial wins justified the next tranche, but dispersion exposed logistics. Concentrating excellence had been the old trick, one showpiece battery beside a museum. Stealth forced competence everywhere, and competence doesn't copy like blueprints. A Nebo M accepted into service went to a brigade whose depot lacked spares, whose trucks drank fuel the quartermaster didn't have, whose operators rotated before they mastered the menu. The array stood straight, the vans hummed, the scope looked beautiful. The duty officer admitted they didn't leave it up in wind. Across town, the accountants wrote a sentence that never went to press. Counter-stealth cost growth is unsustainable. Inside ministries, someone underlined unsustainable and added, reallocate from non-critical sectors. Non-critical meant agriculture, transit, clinics. A deputy asked why the new fence dimmed neighborhoods 2 towns over. He was told to be proud. Pride didn't boil water. Another micro scene. A depot chief uncrated a timing module and found a missing oven-controlled crystal oscillator. The packing slip read, install when available. He called a friend who knew a man across a border who knew a price. The part arrived in a plain box labeled kitchen. Under load, it sang slightly off-key. They made it work and guessed which storms would make it lie. Meanwhile, the threat didn't pause for parity. F-117 in Desert Storm opened with radars and command posts. The eyes and nerves meant to see them first. Tapes that crossed desks in Moscow argued cost more clearly than any editorial. If you can't see the opener, you don't get a second act. Requisitions shifted from urgent to existential. Existential requisitions make bad economists. The ministries approved everything in principle and funded nothing in full. On paper, coverage maps went green. In practice, gaps hardened in strange places, between stations that didn't share clocks, between crews that didn't share doctrine, between promises and power sockets. Units learned a new drill. Acknowledge a ghost track, vector a fighter into empty air, right, no further activity observed. By now, the weapon wasn't the airplane. It was the invoice it wrote for anyone who tried to erase it. Low observables had turned absence into a billable offense. The USSR, already balancing oil, grain, and a fiction about defense share, started paying interest on invisibility, compounding in masked steel, op-amps, diesel, and missed dinners. Detection had always been expensive. Stealth made the price arrive on time. Black jets in the desert. Stakes moved from test ranges to targets when absence met orders. If the F-117's promise was math, its proof came quiet over Panama. December 1989, no fanfare, no announcement. 2 black shapes slipped through cloud toward Noriega's defenses. The picture on the scopes looked like weather. The bombs wrote neat handwriting on hangars, barracks, a PDF headquarters. In an after-action note, a line read almost bored, no early warning track. That sentence traveled farther than the airplanes did. The crews who flew it remembered the silence first. Briefings in windowless rooms, routes shaved to single degrees so a facet never wandered into a broadside. Checklists that banned convenience, no radar altimeter, no friendly beacons, because anything easy was loud. Night vision goggles tuned to a cockpit that barely glowed. A cough in the mask felt like a broadcast. They stepped to jets that looked wrong sitting still, pointed them into darkness, and trusted a black box to lie to the wings until the wings believed. Back in vans built to Soviet diagrams, operators wrestled with gear that wasn't broken so much as speaking the wrong language. VHF could hint, and over-the-horizon Q could point, but the kill chain required a track, and the track kept melting into clutter because the returns that mattered were designed to look like everything else. A battery commander got a voice call, possible, and a bearing with a question mark. By the time the angle resolved, the angle was behind him. In January 1991, the thesis scaled. Desert Storm opened before dawn with black jets punctual, not fast, threading Iraqi airspace along routes the mission planner's model liked. The first targets weren't glamorous. They were eyes and nerves, Radars, command bunkers, communications nodes, picked from catalogs that looked familiar in Moscow. On the tapes that crossed desks a week later, radar-guided SAMs mattered early, then faded into statistics. AAA-stitched airware doctrine said targets would appear. The black jets didn't run that play. Cockpit video told the story in plain geometry. A crosshair paused, slid, paused again. Laser spots pinned aimpoints beneath the noise floor. Bombs walked down rooflines like a teacher's neat strokes. Infrared caught blast waves rippling courtyards in black and white. Post-strike imagery showed holes where doors had been. Nothing miraculous, just mission plans meeting physics under a moon that didn't care. It was the kind of proof a PVO staff couldn't file under rumor. A micro story landed hardest. A hardened command bunker, confident in concrete and habit, took a direct hit through its air shaft, a throat no one thought a bomb could swallow. The tape sat on a Moscow desk, surrounded by ashtrays and men who didn't smoke inside until that week. They didn't argue about jamming anymore. They argued about cost. Inside the squadrons, the discipline looked like superstition turned professional. Edges wiped with gloved hands until a seam felt like a blade. You're measured in pencil notes because a degree bloomed returns. Maintenance logs scolded sloppy rivets as if they were treason. If invisibility was rented, this was the rent, procedures that priced minutes in attention. In Iraqi vans, the human moments turned technical frustration into fatigue. A crew switched bands and found snow. Gain up, and the scope bloomed into uselessness. A sector commander tried to raise batteries whose cable trunks lay in smoking trenches. A technician in a corner practiced the new drill. Acknowledge a ghost, vector a fighter, log, no further activity observed. The doctrine that lived by a ladder felt its first rung gone. The bureaucratic shockwave followed fast. Post-war assessments in Moscow closed loopholes denial had sheltered. Unacceptable detection probability appeared in memos that knew what it was admitting. Orders arrived with urgency that made bad economics worse. Accelerate VHF fields, expand Nebo deployments, trial multistatic nets, fund passive receivers. Everything the slides had promised in principle now carried procurement numbers. Back where the jets lived, tempo cooled. Hangars shut their doors. The black jets returned to rumor with tail numbers, but the tapes didn't go quiet. Planners watched them like coaches study film. Technicians fed them back into models. Lessons turned into muscle. The routes, the timings, the way a radar face flinches before it speaks. A micro scene from a debrief stuck with a crew chief years later. A young pilot pointed at a still frame, a concrete square with a circle inside, and said, "Air shaft." He traced the path his bomb would take in a building he'd never enter. No swagger, just confidence in a map made from absence. He closed the binder, sipped cold coffee, and wrote a note the tape didn't need. Do not yaw. Across the ocean, generals who'd spent careers measuring range rings by catalogue began measuring by silence. The map they trusted didn't know how to price a hole, but the ledger did. A quiet airplane had taught a louder truth. If the opener can't be seen, the rest of your doctrine is algebra with a missing term. And every minute you spend trying to find that term carries a cost you can't hide in the margins. The counter-stealth arms race no one could afford. Stakes hardened into a single sentence nobody wrote down. To see one airplane, the Soviet Union had to rebuild the way it saw everything. The S-300 belts on paper looked like strength, smarter missiles, better seekers, wider envelopes. But stealth had moved the first question from can you shoot to can you see, so procurement sprouted branches. Pair batteries with Nebo VHF UHF, arrays to catch edges shaping tried to starve. Trial by static and multi-static geometries, transmitters and receivers stretched across kilometers to triangulate whispers below noise. Add passive nets, Kolchuga-style ears listening for echoes off city radio, and TV, airport radars, anything loud enough to betray a hole where an airplane should have been. Each layer promised confidence. Each layer wrote a bill. Field tests arrived like relief. A Nebo SVU crew parked on a ridge and reported detections conventional sets missed. A multi-static trial teased a track from clutter under controlled conditions. A A passive array stitched transients into a line that matched a known flight with seconds to spare. Slides filled with green dots, acronyms, and the most dangerous word in any staff brief, scalable. Then scale arrived, and the physics of economics took over. 5 prototypes rode on hand, picked parts, borrowed clocks, and engineers sleeping on site. Turning 5 into 50 required silicon the domestic base struggled to produce, and an integration discipline no decree could conjure. The bottlenecks read like a plan the market had vetoed. Nebo's digital back-ends wanted high-reliability op-amps and clean-time bases. COCOM lists made those parts scarce or expensive. Substitutions added hiss that forced software compensations that demanded faster processors that factories couldn't build at volume. A single missed spec cascaded until acceptance tests carried the phrase, within revised tolerance. Systems worked in parades. They lied in storms. Human angles sharpened the irony. Engineers knew exactly what to buy: better ACs, tighter oscillators, disciplined sync across sites, and could sketch the bill of materials from memory. Plant directors knew the reality: older machine tools, fewer shifts, procurement officers paying in IOUs. Staff colleges updated syllabi to teach counter-stealth tactics. Regimental commanders updated rosters to reflect conscripts trained on vacuum sets now staring at digital scopes they didn't trust. Everyone repeated modernization like a prayer and counted screws like agnostics. Meanwhile, Western investments doubled down on the thing Moscow was paying to erase. The F-117's mission planner improved its chess. The B-2 matured. The idea wasn't to outrun defenses. It was to keep changing presentation angles the model liked. So every Soviet fix arrived into a moving problem. A Nebo field might catch an edge at one aspect. The next generation route shaved a degree and fell back into noise. The net learned. The fish changed shape. A deputy premier asked a question that sounded pedantic and wasn't. How many megawatts does an over-the-horizon fence drink in winter? The answer dimmed neighborhoods. Someone's city would go dark, so a queue might nudge a sector that might find a dot that might be a flock. Planners colored maps green. Power managers colored outage schedules red. Pride handled the discrepancy. Pride didn't boil water. Prototype success didn't scale because logistics didn't bend. A Nebo M accepted into service arrived at a brigade whose depot had no spares, whose trucks drank diesel the quartermaster didn't have, whose operators rotated before mastering menus. On inspection day, the array stood straight, the vans hummed, the scope looked beautiful. The duty officer admitted they didn't leave it up in wind. A passive network strung along a frontier celebrated an intriguing track that turned out to be a TV relay bouncing off a hill. Confidence dies in small corrections. A micro-story from a regional hub captured the treadmill. The fusion center merged 2 partials into one solid track. Cheering in the van sounded like old pride. Then the lights flickered. The local grid couldn't carry the system and the city together. The track died. A lieutenant logged the moment and wrote 2 words a historian would circle later: almost works. Leadership couldn't retreat without confessing theology was wrong. So they ordered everything at once. S-300 PM upgrades, beside extended Nebo fields, beside multi-static trials, beside papers on L-band noses for fighters, beside proposals for photonic front ends nobody could fabricate. Each choice made sense alone. Together, they made a trap. A national commitment to seeing better that required a national economy capable of building better for years, coherently. From the engineer's perspective, the patches would have sown a net, given 10 quiet years and steady supply. The quiet years never came. Oil slid. Chips didn't appear. Ministries didn't share clocks. The arms race no one could afford wasn't a sprint. It was a treadmill set 1 notch faster than the country's lungs. Across an ocean, crews rolled black jets into hangars, wiped knife edges with gloved hands, and waited to ask the same expensive question again.